The threat of tariffs becoming a forceful change in global trade policy that later put the Canadian car market in a frenzy.
A frenzy and fear.
Canada's trade deficit widens as auto trade weakens, and we've got these highlights here. Canada's trade deficit widened in January as exports of motor vehicles and parts fell to the lowest level in more than 4 years.
Canada's automotive industry, a cornerstone of the nation's economy, is facing an unprecedented crisis.
Canada's auto sector is getting crushed even worse than anyone predicted. Experts are now warning Ottawa that if Canada keeps drifting away from the United States, the damage will not be temporary. It will be catastrophic for the future of the auto production in this country. And as collapse is happening right now, factories are under threat, jobs are on the line, and Canada's industries are being put on the chopping block.
He says CUSMA is basically irrelevant and that the U.S. doesn't need Canadian parts or anything made in Canada in terms of autos.
Let's start with the numbers because the numbers are brutal.
Got these highlights here. Canada's trade deficit widened in January as exports of motor vehicles and parts fell to the lowest level in more than 4 years. The decrease in exports was driven by a sharp decline in vehicle and part shipments, which fell by 21% to 5.4 billion. The country's policymakers are aiming to offset the damage to the sector, with Prime Minister Carney's unveiling a new plan to bolster domestic vehicle production with increased financial incentives for car makers.
In January 2026, Canada's motor vehicle and parts exports collapsed by 21% to just $5.4 billion. That is the lowest level since September 2021. Canada's trade deficit widened, and autos were sitting right at the center of that damage. This is not one bad month in one bad sector. When your highest value manufacturing export engine starts sputtering this hard, the weakness bleeds outward fast into jobs, investor confidence, trade performance, and provincial revenues. One sector, 1 month, billions gone. Now zoom out, and the picture gets even uglier.
Automakers assembled 1.2 million vehicles in Canada last year. That's down 8% from 2024. That decline may not look as troubling in isolation. BMO's senior economist Eric Johnson wrote in the report, Recharging Canada's Auto Industry, but it represents a 33% decline from 2019.
In 2016, Canada built roughly 2.3 million vehicles. By 2025, that number had crashed to about 1.2 million. That's 1.1 million vehicles gone. That's not underperformance. That is an industrial collapse happening in slow motion. And here's what makes it terrifying. Canada is not declining because the whole continent collapsed. The United States is far closer to its old production base. Mexico has actually moved ahead and strengthened its position. Canada is the only major North American auto producer still sitting meaningfully below pre-pandemic levels. Canada is not falling behind because the game got harder. Canada is falling behind while its competitors are adapting around it.
GM workers in Oshawa walked off their shift for the last time. The plant canceled the third shift 8 months ago, but this morning was the final date for hundreds of workers. Canada's auto industry is undergoing major changes, but U.S. President Trump says his tariffs are driving Canadian companies back to the U.S.
The Detroit retreat makes this even more painful to watch. Ford, GM, and Stellantis once dominated Canadian production with a 56% share in 2016. By 2025, that share had collapsed to 23%. That's not a rebalancing. That is a strategic withdrawal. GM's Oshawa shift cut alone sent shock waves through the supply chain, with up to 1,200 workers expected to feel the impact. These are not random companies walking away. These are legacy anchors of everything Canada built its auto identity on. When your original industrial partners stop expanding and start trimming, they are not being cautious. They are telling you exactly what they think your future looks like. People's anxiety about what our partnership with our big brother has turned into, and can we rely on them anymore? Should we trust them anymore? In the years since the last auto show, much has happened in the Ontario auto industry. Some companies have moved production to the U.S. Others have dropped shifts here, and still others, like Toyota, have stayed the course. We control what we can control. So who is left holding Canadian auto production together right now? Toyota and Honda, two companies now accounting for 77% of what Canada still builds. That sounds stable until you realize what that actually means. Canada's entire auto manufacturing base is now balanced on two players. If either one of them changes strategy, delays a mandate, or shifts investment, Canada feels it immediately and massively. People confuse concentration with resilience. They are actually the opposite of each other. A shrinking industrial base looks stable right up until the moment it doesn't. We control what we can control. Toyota Canada built 537,000 vehicles in 2025, up from the year before. The company has decided not to react when the U.S. president makes threats, sticking to business. We haven't really changed anything, to be honest. We're trying to stay calm. When we look at it objectively, I think the North American automotive industry works best when all three countries are participating. Here is the logic that too many people refuse to accept. Auto manufacturing needs scale. A single plant costs billions to build and billions more to retool. Those costs only make sense when production runs are massive. Canada's domestic market is nowhere near large enough to justify that scale on its own. Canadians still bought about 1.87 million new vehicles in 2025, while only producing around 1.2 million. Demand exists, but consumer demand and manufacturing viability are two completely different things. You cannot save an auto industry on sentiment. You save it on scale, and scale requires access to a massive market. Donald Trump says he wants every car sold in the U.S. to be made in the U.S., and he's willing to disrupt an entire industry to make that happen. If we don't make a deal with Canada, we're going to put a big tariff on cars. Could be a 50 or 100% because we don't want their cars. Canada's auto model was never built on Canada. It was built on access to America. That is the central truth underneath this entire crisis. Canadian plants survived and thrived because they were plugged into a continental production system where the U.S. market made the math work. Without that privileged access, Canadian assembly becomes nearly impossible to justify at scale. The fantasy that Canada can remain a serious auto manufacturing nation while drifting away from the U.S. industrial system is exactly that, a fantasy. And right now, Canada is living inside that fantasy while the real world moves on without it. We turn now to the growing level of economic uncertainty surrounding the North American auto industry. The Big Three are navigating a new era as they deal with the impact of President Trump's tariffs. Now, General Motors and Stellantis are already feeling the impact, and now we're waiting to hear from Ford. GM says its second quarter profits fell by $1 billion. Industry experts are being as loud as politically polite language allows them to be. They are warning that if Canada and the U.S. continue diverging on regulations, tariffs, EV standards, and production conditions, manufacturers will choose the larger market. They will not announce it dramatically. They will just quietly stop sending new mandates north. The danger is not an overnight collapse. It is a 5 to 6 year hollowing out. And here is the thing about that timeline. Manufacturers plan years ahead. They don't wait for the disaster to arrive before reallocating their capital. By the time governments feel the full pain, the private sector has already made the decision and moved on. Canada was also badly positioned even before the newest trade shocks hit. The North American market had already shifted hard toward SUVs and pickup trucks, while Canada remained too tied to passenger car production. When product cycles turned over, Canada was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Plants lost programs and did not secure strong enough replacements. Then EV policy was supposed to be the rescue narrative. Instead, it became a stress narrative. ZEV registrations in Canada fell 34.7% in 2025. Battery electric registrations fell 43.1%. Honda delayed its $15 billion Ontario EV project by roughly 2 years. When your flagship future strategy needs emergency support before it even fully launches, that's not a growth story. That is a warning flare. Ottawa's response has been to spend billions from the Strategic Response Fund, consumer EV incentives, charging infrastructure money, and transition support for manufacturing. And all of that sounds impressive until you ask one single question. Why does an industry need the government to simultaneously subsidize demand, production, transition, and consumer confidence all at the same time? The answer is that the underlying economics are deteriorating. Subsidies can buy time. They cannot restore competitiveness. The auto sector supports over 500,000 workers across Canada. It contributes more than $16 billion annually to GDP. When auto weakens, the damage does not stay in the factory. It travels outward through the economy like a shock wave, hitting suppliers, provincial revenues, investment pipelines, and national trade numbers all at once. Ontario feels it first, but Canada pays for it nationally. Capital is already rewriting its opinion of Canada in real time. Honda's delay sent a message. GM's cut sent a message. Uncertain EV mandates sent a message. Rising subsidy dependency also sent a message. That message is that Canada is no longer an obvious, stable, high-confidence destination for long-term auto investment. Investment follows predictability. Right now, Canada looks expensive, exposed, and politically tied to trade conditions that nobody can fully predict. Decline in manufacturing is rarely linear. It accelerates the moment scale breaks, and Canada is getting dangerously close to the breaking point in multiple plants simultaneously. Then there is also a China dimension making everything more volatile. Canada's positioning on Chinese EV-related access creates friction with Washington at exactly the moment Canada needs Washington's goodwill the most. Canada is caught in a three-way squeeze, too dependent on the U.S. to drift away freely, too weak to build a fully independent auto future, too exposed globally to ignore the pressure coming from Chinese manufacturing competition. Every direction Canada moves creates new risk. Do we seriously believe Canada is still a major automotive manufacturing nation? The old production model is breaking down. The EV transition is already wobbling. The Detroit Three are pulling back. Plants face uncertainty. Exports are sliding. Subsidies are rising. And the U.S. relationship is under strain. At some point, the debate stops being about saving every factory and becomes about whether Canada still has the scale, access, and industrial strength to remain a major production power. Leaders keep talking about transition and modernization, but the evidence points to contraction and growing vulnerability. The real danger is not a tough adjustment ahead. It is that the decline may already be underway while policymakers still speak as if this is just another upgrade cycle.